Hey folks, it is Thursday, July 10th. That means yesterday was Wednesday, July 9th. So the latest Colorado State Atlantic hurricane season forecast is out. So I want to kind of dive into the details with that at the beginning of this video. And then I'm going to parlay that into a discussion on what that might mean, obviously, for hurricanes in North America, maybe the Caribbean, but even the precipitation conversation, perhaps some drought conversation as we peer into August and then September. Those are kind of our two big hurricane months. So I'm going to look at some historical analogs for those. We'll look at the details of that hurricane forecast, and then that's going to tie in a little bit, at least over the next kind of 30 to 60 days with the movement of the MJO. So Eric talked about that yesterday, so we can tie that in as well with respects to precipitation, where we might see thunderstorms. There is this kind of specter of drought concern, at least at the end of this summer, given some of the seasonal forecast models. But I agree with Eric. There is some serious skepticism on my part and his with the accuracy of those going forward, just given the lack of performance, frankly, this summer. I think that's warranted. Now, starting this morning, just looking at the infrared satellite imagery across the Atlantic basin, that's what we'll call this here, from the coast of Africa here all the way over to North America. There's really not too much going on underneath that. And that's because, and Eric mentioned the reason for this yesterday, we tend to have some suppression right now because of the MJO in phases well off into the eastern hemisphere, and just not a conducive environment right now in the Atlantic for hurricanes. The reason for that, if you can see, it's hard to see in the infrared, but you notice this kind of tongue of like grayer colors here? This is actually a Saharan air layer that's pushing east to west across the Atlantic. These tend to reduce convections. You can see just underneath this, there's no tropical thunderstorms whatsoever in what we call the main development region. So I'm going to try to write that out. The MDR, the main development region, is this corridor here where we typically watch some of these African easterly waves continue to coalesce. But when that's clear, we typically know that over the next few days we're not going to be seeing much activity. But this kind of look here is going to be something I start my morning with more often, at least over the next kind of 2 to 3 months. Now, if we dive into that hurricane forecast specifically, I'll make this a little bit bigger. To put it simply, any given year in the Atlantic, we typically see 14 named storms. That's tropical storm strength or above when they're named and classified as a tropical cyclone. The Colorado State forecast released yesterday trimmed their forecast from 17, which was still above average, above 14 named storms, down to 16. They also trimmed the named storm days, the amount of hurricanes they're expecting this year, down to 8, just one above average. And then kind of critically, major hurricanes, these are the ones that cause a significant amount of damage, at least with respect to wind, flooding obviously as well, down to 3, which is roughly average. So the forecast is still what I would call above average, but definitely down to slightly above average. Now they will release another forecast of this in early August, and that one tends to, given that it's kind of right at the doorstep of the peak of the season, tends to be even more accurate. So I'm kind of curious to see where they go from here. And that's kind of an important fork in the road, I think, going forward, at least obviously in terms of tropical cyclone and hurricane activity, but ultimately for some precipitation as well. We know these can come up through the U.S. As they make landfall, they weaken, but there's still, as we saw with Beryl last year, there's tornado outbreaks associated with them, flash flooding while inland. If you think about August, September, October, it's a time of year where we're trying to harvest, maybe dry down a crop, not necessarily bring more moisture in. And the reason I'm showing the Colorado State one is because, frankly, they're excellent scientists over there. It's always kind of funny to think about, over there in right in the middle of Colorado, south of Denver, that they are, renowned and reputable hurricane forecasters. But if you have the scientists to do it in that location, they kind of congregated there, you're going to put together a pretty good staff. And they do well historically. So this is looking at the correlation between those Colorado State forecasts and the ultimate Atlantic hurricane frequency. And you can see that in this June to August update, they do pretty well. You're looking at over the last 10 years, correlation values up near about 80. So that is pretty darn good for seasonal forecasts, especially compared to some of our forecasts go with respects to precip and temperature. Now, the reason that they trimmed this back is because of increased wind shear over the last few weeks in the Atlantic, particularly in the Caribbean. Remember, we drew that MDR, that main development region here, kind of east of the Caribbean and west of Africa. Now, the red values shaded here, I kind of clipped off the color bar. These are increased wind shear. And hurricanes are fairly simple. They like kind of warm bathwater sea surface temperatures. We've talked about that before. But almost more critically, they need a lack of wind shear. That helps them to organize that coherent spin in the low levels of the atmosphere and then stack that underneath spin in the upper levels of the atmosphere. And if you have too much shear, I can almost like draw this vertically. So just kind of ignore the plot here. But here might be the upper levels of the atmosphere. If that spin underneath is not co-located kind of right underneath it, that's not going to allow the hurricane to further develop and organize. So we always look at wind shear as kind of a critical component to that hurricane season forecast. Now that's connected to some of the flooding that we've seen recently. I mean, we've seen a number of flash flooding events over the last few days. Obviously, the Texas Hill Country floods that we've talked about. And part of the reason is we've had just these racing trade winds out of the Atlantic. And you can think of these surface winds blowing east to west across the Caribbean as a contribution to that wind shear. So these have been so strong. And the upper level winds above this, if I can show you the upper level winds, have been, rather stationary across the Caribbean. So you have a lot of this underneath, not a lot of wind speed above it. And so that actually gives you wind shear, because that low level spin is going to be racing off to the west and not allowing that kind of vertical stack of that hurricane development. So it's even related to some of the flooding that we've seen recently with those strong winds and the trade winds coming through the Caribbean up into the United States, bringing that warm, moist air. Now, this also has another kind of what we'll call a negative effect, in that those strong trades off the coast of Africa all the way across over the Caribbean has cooled the ocean waters and the main development region as well. So we're not seeing as warm, kind of bathwater-like temperatures. They're still warm enough for hurricanes, right? But underneath that increased wind shear from the west to the east across this area, we have to trim those hurricane expectations back a little bit. But I will say, given the kind of background remnant La Nina state, that tends to be a positive for hurricane development, at least in historical years. And they mention that in the forecast as well. So we have, maybe a positive contributor, a negative contributor, and a few other kind of dynamical models suggesting at least an average season. So still a slightly above average forecast right now, but we'll have to see where that goes in the months ahead critically. I went back and looked at the top 10 hurricane seasons by named storms. So there's a number of different ways to kind of measure hurricane activity in the Atlantic. You can use something called ACE or ACE, that is Atlantic Cyclone Energy, I believe, and that kind of accumulated cyclone energy. And that is a kind of accumulation of all the sort of the number of hours and days that some of these strong storms have developed. There's another way you can kind of think of it as how many hurricanes, how many named storms, that tropical storm strength. Plus, there's a number of different ways. I just went with named storms. So how many tropical storm strength or stronger systems did we see? I think Barry just showed us how strong or how impactful even a tropical storm can be in its remnants, let alone it wasn't even a hurricane or category 1, 2, or 3. Beryl, which caused a number of issues through the middle part of the country, made landfall as a category 1. It doesn't necessarily matter all the time. It's somewhat semantics whether it's a 2 or a 3, or a 3 versus a 4 for the folks that are getting impacted inland by some of the flooding. So I went back and I looked at all these top 10 years, and you can see the ones in here. 2020 was included. We actually, I believe, 2024 with all the named storms last year. Curiously, 2012 and 2011, those were big La Nina years, and we saw drought as a result earlier in the growing season during those years. You can see each one I picked up here. And curiously, there's 33 as well. And then I went ahead and said, what were the precipitation anomalies like between August and October? So late summer into fall. And you can see a decent signal for reduced precipitation across the middle part of the country. Relatively wet over in the east, and pretty inconsequential over in the western U.S., save for far western Washington. Kind of curious that in all these years to see reduced precipitation. Now, I could come in here and get more critical. I could remove 2012 or 33, but I thought, let's just keep them in. Let's keep the thought experiment consistent and look at precipitation values at the end of summer, early fall, given these high-ranking hurricane years. And I always say, whenever we're looking at a hurricane, show me the ridge. There's always a ridge nearby steering it. And if you're going to have a landfalling hurricane come up here, whether it's Katrina, 2012 we saw Sandy come up here, you're going to have some sort of ridge either to the northeast or the north of it steering it into the North American coastline. You're going to have something like this, and then a weakness in the flow allowing it to get through. So anytime we see these kind of big hurricane years, I always look for maybe a ridge either setting up in this area here or over the middle part of the country to allow that hurricane to kind of sneak into this area, whether it's Hurricane Andrew, Rita, and then the last few years, the number of ones we saw in this area, Hurricane Laura came through here. Now, you would think you would see, even with some of the landfalls here, increased precipitation, but it's not always so simple. I mean, even Helene, which brought tremendous amounts of rain to North Carolina, right after it came through, you had one of the driest stretches in North Carolina history. So the weather, when you try to do these 3-month aggregates, never plays along, right? The weather is a day-to-day phenomenon, and then we try with these August, September, October analogs to boil it down to just 3 months, and it's not always so simple. And kind of an effort to simplify it at least a little bit more, also pulled up the Palmer drought indices for those same analog years, so top 10. And I shouldn't really call them an analog years. This is more just a thought experiment that if we have a busy year, might we expect reduced precipitation in this area? And I think the answer to that, at least looking at this, is yes. So some concern here, if that busy forecast verifies 16, 17, maybe we go well above that Colorado State forecast, get toward 19 or 20 named storms. At least in the years where we were top 10 in that department, we tended to be drier in here in late summer and early fall. Perhaps a friendly forecast for drying down some crops that are on the weather side, given some of the precipitation that we've seen. But looking at drought across the Mississippi River Valley, that's not necessarily something we want either, given some of the stalled barge traffic in years prior. I did also want to zoom in just on August specifically on these same years. So did we see some of that dryness settle in even early in the season in the month of August? The answer appears to be yes, all the way up from Houston toward Des Moines. Saw some of those drier climate divisions starting to show up, even just zooming in on the month of August. Another piece to this, of course, is the MJO. So Eric talked about this yesterday. The phases that we're in now, kind of 5, 6, and 7, tend to be conducive for some of the northwest ridging that we've seen. We talked even like in early June about how if we saw the MJO set up in maybe phases 1, 2, or 3 over here in the Indian Ocean, that tended to correlate with more ridging across the Midwest, which we haven't seen a ton of, kind of late June into early July. We saw it briefly at the end of June with the heat wave. We haven't seen it as we switched into these like critical days in July. And the reason is because we've just been over here in phase 5, 6, and 7. Now, out into the forecast, this takes us down through the forecast here. I'm pulling this out to July 20th. We can see the MJO moving across the Pacific slowly to the point that at the end of the month, it might be starting to get over here into portions of the, what we'll call the Western Hemisphere here, but maybe phases 8 and over toward 1. And that could help spur some Atlantic tropical development as we get maybe toward the end of July, certainly the early part of August. We also sometimes with the MJO see a lag. So as the MJO comes through the Atlantic, it helps to boil some convection. That takes a number of days to organize into a hurricane, and they can almost lag it by like 7 to 8 days. So maybe the MJO passes this area here in the first kind of calendar week of August, and then a few days after that, the first or second week of August, we see hurricane activity pick up. In the meantime, I showed you at the beginning of this video, right, the lull that we're seeing here in the Atlantic. The reason I think for that is clear here. This is suppression in the atmosphere. This is descent. So not conducive for tropical convection and hurricanes. This is July 10th. So here's the present date. And this is parked right over that main development region. So until we get rid of this, I don't think we're going to see this map get very busy here. This is the National Hurricane Center, the 7-day outlook. Now that same suppression area is still kind of over here, parked over here in the Eastern Pacific as well. And so if you look over here, unlike what we saw in June and even parts of early July here, I think it's the first time in a while I've woken up and I've seen the big white text here, tropical cyclone activity, not expected over the next 7 days. Now, Eric did this kind of thought experiment yesterday. I'm just going to run through it one more time. If we do, so let's start today. So like the analog for maybe this week, so July 10th, phases 6. You could maybe argue that, let's take it out into a forecast to July 20th. I'm looking at the week of July 20th and the analog for phase 6, which we're currently in. And you can see very nicely, there's that northwest ridge. There's that trough over the Midwest. I'm kind of spoiling my forecast a little bit. That's a great analog because we're talking about troughs over the next 7 days, pushing through the Midwest, some fronts as well. But if we start taking this a little further, phase 7, you see that ridge continue, phase 8, see it continue, but now we got to jump over because remember, we didn't see that MJO reach that kind of calendar month of August until later. And let's jump that over. There's July. They're perfect, right? At kind of the end of the month. But if we jump into phase 1 or 2 at the end of July, man, large signal for a ridge over the Midwest. So we're getting closer, kind of closer to that analog as the MJO continues to push across July. Now, at the end of this video, there's some differences. This is the ECMWF ensemble. It has been more progressive. And what I mean by that is it's tried to move this MJO more predictably all the way over here into maybe phases 1 and 2 and 3. And it's been a little bit drier near the end of the month. Now, not all the models are doing that, but it is one, right? It's one scenario we need to watch for if we're finally going to get some proper heat into the Midwest. Still early in that part of the forecast, but at least wanted to show you that thought process there. Now, we've seen this, right, with the let's call this the 30-day anomalies. I'm going to take this out through August. Let's take it out through August 15th here. We've seen some of this dryness build in, right? That almost kind of looks similar to what we saw with that hurricane thought experiment. So if the hurricane activity picks up in the early part of August. You know, it wouldn't shock me if some of this area goes dry here. But the CCMWF extended forecast, the one that actually goes out 30 days, it has performed really poorly, right? It missed the floods in Texas, missed some other signals earlier this year. And this forecast, including kind of Eric's conversation yesterday with respect to the seasonal forecast from the ECMWF, I'm almost equally as skeptical of this extended forecast right now. If anything, it's just playing out a scenario for us to keep an eye on right now. But I'm looking at less like a bona fide forecast going forward over the next 30 to 45 days. All right, let's jump up to the present weather really quickly here. So I want to cover the last 24 hours of precipitation just to show all the rainfall that we saw come through the Carolinas, Virginia, portions of Maryland, over the Delmarva Peninsula. We saw Wilmington, Delaware, I believe that's up here near the northern part of the state. Reports of some water rescues here. We've seen over the last week, obviously, the Texas floods. We also saw 6 inches of rainfall near downtown Chicago, near the United Center. Reports of water rescues and viaducts flooded through that area. And then with some of the flood warnings over in the east, it's becoming clear that it's July. We have kind of a lack of flow, at least in this area. And I am concerned that as we go kind of through the next 7 days, we're going to continue to see some of these flash floodings that aren't easily forecasted because summer weather is just, where forecast accuracy is not as good. And we have all this moisture and heat to work with in portions of the southeast. So continue to follow those warnings and heed the evacuations. And obviously praying for the first responders in some of these events as they come through. We have the Storm Prediction Center, the reports as of yesterday. We can see along with some of the heavy rainfall and the flooding, so a number of wind reports. Luckily, none of these up near that kind of significant level where we would see typically a number of power outages. We do see some of those in South Dakota yesterday with some of the severe storms that came through there. You can see a number of the wind reports. Those are actually kind of weakening right now. They blew through similar to where I showed you on Tuesday. If I pull up that radar mosaic, see a nice little MCV spinning here across southwest Minnesota. See that kind of spin in the radar returns it. It's always neat to see those. We've seen a number of those in July. The weakening storm systems overnight, this is bringing some rainfall through the central part of Iowa. And if we just look, right, been keeping an eye on this area. That's gone over dry a few times this year. I'm going to jump to the last 72 hours of precip. See some areas in here did pick up some meaningful precipitation. You start to get into the blues and that purple color if I zoom down to the color bar. So we start going from about a half inch up to an inch of rain. So there are some counties in here really along I-80, just to the south of it, even in northwest Indiana, southwest Michigan, which has picked up some appreciable rainfall. Now, it's not everybody in here. In fact, I can see some white sneaking through. Look at parts of eastern Iowa, even the central part of the state. But luckily, precip coming through here. Now, it is weakening, right? It's kind of dying on the vine here as it reaches the Mississippi River, as that likes to do in July. But the forecast is still looking relatively friendly for more chances through this area. Still keeping an eye on it, but I'm feeling less concerned about it as I was maybe last week. If we look at the upper level height pattern really quick, this is at 500 millibars, so just looking at where the wind, the ridges, and the troughs are. You can see this kind of generally weak troughing here across the eastern U.S. You can kind of draw the lines here like that. This is indicative of a front pushing through the eastern U.S. So without this kind of getting out into the Atlantic, expecting unfortunately another day of precipitation here across the southeast, the Carolinas, up into the mid-Atlantic as well, not as potent, I think, as yesterday or the day before. Over the southwest, we can see this ridge. It's getting squashed a little bit by this trough that's pushing through here, maybe near Salt Lake City. And that's good news because yesterday, this ridge was cranking here over the southwest. And that actually broke a daytime, for the date, a record for the high temperature in Phoenix, Arizona at the airport there, 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, luckily, the summer hasn't been as brutally hot as years past, maybe even 2024. But we do kind of record the average between the daytime high and the nighttime high, and that's on here. And when that's up, at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, your average of the daytime high and the overnight low, you had a pretty hot day in Phoenix. And 118 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe their all-time record in Phoenix is 122, and only 4 degrees away from that all-time record. So that's some brutal temperatures. And even if we look at the temperatures this morning, I'm recording this video about 6 a.m., we set it, all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 6 a.m. Central. So over here in Phoenix, I'll be honest, I can't remember if Phoenix is Mountain or Pacific time. But regardless, 4 or 5 a.m. and you're already at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's not a good time. I think it's fair to say. Extreme heat warnings continue there today. Fortunately, the forecast is not expected to be quite as hot, maybe to temper down to like something cool like 114 degrees Fahrenheit, not 118. But seeing some red flag warnings, some heat advisories persisting across kind of the northern Sacramento Valley, portions of Southern California as well. Pretty quiet across the rest of the United States here. A few lingering severe thunderstorm warnings. This was 5:15 Central. Let me update that because, yeah, those are now expired. And flood watch is continuing here for the Carolinas, Virginia, over toward the Delmarva Peninsula with some of the recent rainfall. Want to jump over and look at the 500 millibar height pattern this morning? Let's make this valid. Thursday at 7 a.m. near the recording of this video. There's that squashed ridge. You see it kind of flattened out, kind of like a pancake here. Again, reducing the kind of the strength of that in the high temperatures with this little trough moving through Salt Lake City. Again, you don't see like a huge blue trough here, but just, I've mentioned this on Tuesday, this is kind of the weakness in the heights. That's what's being plotted here. And that's indicative of kind of this weak trough with additional precipitation. You know, some of these weak systems in summer, they can drop a lot of rainfall, right? We have to keep an eye on those. That's going to move through today, bringing some extra precipitation there. That Salt Lake City trough over night to night is going to be moving off the Continental Divide. It's going to be paired up with this other one moving through the Canadian Prairie on tomorrow on Friday. I think really more Friday and then into Saturday, we're going to see more precipitation and thunderstorm development through the Central Plains and then into the Midwest as we go through the day Saturday. With this trough here, this will bring temperatures down a little bit as well. Seeing some ridge build into the eastern U.S. That's a change of pace from some of the recent weather. And then we see this re-entrenchment of the ridge over the western U.S. this weekend. As I play this forecast forward, taking us through Monday, Tuesday, we see a ridge try to reestablish over the Midwest and the eastern Corn Belt, portions of the Mid-South, New England. That's the early part of the week. We're setting up a decent July trough here across the Canadian Prairie. And this one's west enough that it's going to try to bring some probably welcome precip over here in areas of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Montana, the western Dakotas. Some areas in here still dry. So that's bringing a chance for precipitation through early next week. The ridge that has been over the northwest is finally getting kind of off the continent there, out into the Pacific. That's allowing this trough to move back a little bit further to the west and the precip along with it. That moves through on a Wednesday through the middle part of the country. Now Thursday PM, trying to get through the Midwest. We're well out into the forecast at this point. This is going to be a decent precipitation maker pushing through the central and eastern part of the country. Could see some ridging build in behind it. We're all the way out to the 20th now of July at this point, but even showing up another precipitation maker behind it. That northwest ridge staying just off the continent, allowing this to get a little bit further west. Again, don't want to put too much weight into a 10-day forecast, but the chance is there. And anytime I see this at the end of the forecast period, by the way, in summer, ridge here across the maritime Canadian provinces, and then a ridge here across the Northeast Pacific, call this the Gulf of Alaska. I mean, the atmospheres can be simple sometimes. What goes up here and here, you're going to have to go down in between. You're going to have some sort of trough moving through here. You're not really going to be able to have a ridge, a ridge like that. It's going to be, this will generally support troughing precipitation chances and lower temperature concerns in this area here. And if I just take you out the 6 to 10 day forecast from the Climate Prediction Center, cooler than average temperatures expected the 15th through the 19th. Warmth in New England, warmth near that ridge over the western U.S. Show you the precipitation, precipitation chances over the middle part of the country, increasing too with that ridge moving further away from the southwest during that forecast period. If I jump you back and show that, without that ridge parked here, that ridging generally staying up here near the northwest is allowing some of this flow to return back to the southwest, more monsoonal-like flow. Phoenix, with the heat, is actually, despite some of the recent thunderstorms this year, in the general vicinity, is below average in its yearly precipitation. All right, let's put this together in the ECMWF precipitation forecast here. I'm going to play this forward pretty quickly. So this is today on Thursday. Take this into the afternoon. That weak trough moving through the southeast, the Carolinas, up in the mid-Atlantic. You can see the precipitation continuing here. Flood watches are active, and some of these rivers are swollen from Chantal. The remnant system that came through brought the flash flooding to North Carolina. And then just the last few days, we've seen severe reports repeatedly in this corridor here. So additional rainfall coming to that hydrology. Watching to see this afternoon some potential severe storm development over here in the Central Plains. ECMWF not very bullish on that. Are seeing some chances for precipitation here in the southern Canadian Prairie. So I take this into tomorrow. You can see some of that continue here near Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And then this is now Friday evening. Can see more proper development here over Iowa, eastern Nebraska, southern Minnesota, maybe portions of Kansas, northwest Missouri. Overnight, continuing that precipitation. And then Saturday, seeing proper development here over Illinois, maybe even a low pressure system, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. Some of this precipitation getting all the way back over here into the southern plains, portions of the panhandle of Texas. I'm taking this through Sunday now. You can really kind of draw this front all the way from New Mexico through Texas, up through the Mid-South, all the way over toward Ontario and some of the Canadian metropolises here. We do bring that ridge in early next week. I talked about that settling in over the Midwest. That's going to squash some of this precipitation here Monday and Tuesday, bring some heat in, remember, there's that next system, that trough that was trying to push back to the west. Look at the precipitation filling in the southern Canadian prairie. That's Monday. Now Tuesday morning, this getting into portions of Montana, far southern Saskatchewan, portions of Manitoba as well. The Dakotas getting in on that precipitation with that ridge getting kind of off the continent. It's allowing some of that troughing to get all the way back here, producing more bona fide precipitation chances for the northern plains and the prairie area. This is now Tuesday. I'm going to take this into Wednesday afternoon. You can see a proper low pressure system here over Wisconsin, precipitation over Illinois. And then taking this into Thursday afternoon, that's leaving, again, one of these draped fronts across the middle part of the country, a renewed chance for severe development, likely Wednesday and Thursday in this area here. We'll have to look at the details of that when it becomes clearer. And then by the end of the week, pushing off the eastern seaboard, so the southeast, Florida, up the Carolinas, again into New England. And then a high-pressure system developing. And behind that, we saw that in the long-range forecast with maybe another precipitation maker on the way. All that put together in a 10-day forecast, wet across the middle part of the country. Some areas, again, kind of on the, what I said earlier, what the dying on the vine of these storms. As those fronts kind of stall and move to the east, that precipitation becomes a little bit less predictable, but I'm not too concerned. We've seen this area fill in decently with some of these systems this year. And still some concern for the northern Canadian prairie with that trough kind of draped in this orientation. It's allowing that lift to come through the southern Canadian prairie, Montana, the Dakotas at times, over toward Minnesota, leaving this corridor dry here, and the west staying dry largely as well with that general west ridging. I am going to play this. Yeah, we have time. It's at 26 minutes. Let's play this forecast forward. This is the simulated radar from the 3-kilometer NAM here. I'm taking this through this morning and then into this evening. This is 10 p.m. tonight, so you can see severe thunderstorm development. The NAM is bullish on storms today. The NAM is always bullish on storms. So the ECMWF was more skeptical of widespread severe development today, but we are watching Nebraska, portions of Iowa as well, and then those storms weakening overnight. And then as that trough comes in on Friday afternoon, you can see more proper development here, maybe across portions of Iowa, the Midwest, maybe in something here through the Boot Heel of Missouri. Again, the NAM tends to overdo it a little bit, and those storms coming through critically northern Illinois in the overnight hours, and then potentially splitting the thunderstorm risk following day on Saturday, maybe over the upper Midwest and the southern plains. We can actually see this from the Storm Prediction Center here. Here's the day one outlook for today. Across the central plains, Kansas, Nebraska, parts of Iowa, broader chance for weaker development beyond that. I'm going to jump back. I'm going to go to day 2, and I've lost my place. Let's do day 2 on Friday. You can see this shifting a little bit east, northern Missouri, parts of northern Illinois. That marginal risk showing a broader area for thunderstorm development across portions of the Mid-Atlantic and New England as well. And let's go finally to day 3 on Saturday. And then there across the southern high plains, southern Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, the Panhandle, Oklahoma, and the upper Midwest. Now, this is just a marginal risk. We'll see if they upgrade it to slight. I'm not convinced of that right now, but at least shows you where those thunderstorm development are possible. Temperature-wise, with the troughs and ridges moving through pretty quickly, you're going to see that pattern reflected. So here's the high temperature forecast for the lower Colorado River Valley today. Luckily, not seeing 118 today, down, like I said, mid-teens, right? 113, 114 over in Southern California. That's east of the mountains, so well east of the coastline. Take this forecast into Friday, and then Saturday. You can see some warm up here moving in through the Midwest and then the Mid-Atlantic on Saturday. Cool down behind the trough in portions of the plains. That starts to extend a little bit across the Midwest, but as we get into Monday and Tuesday, remember I showed you that ridge trying to build back into this area? See temperatures increasing again, but not significantly so. We could do much worse than this in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. I mean, low 90s, high 80s in the middle part of July. Almost feels like a relief that we're not up near 95 or 96. And then there's that next midweek system coming through the plains, bringing temperatures down significantly across the middle portion of the country with that ridge re-entrenching out west, seeing temperature values rise. 105 southern Oregon, up near 100 in the Willamette Valley, pushing up near triple digits in central Washington, 91 in Spokane. Overnight lows, I'm just going to take this through quickly. You can see generally, low 70s, maybe mid 70s in the mid-south. Not terribly concerning, and then coming down in a big way as we go through the week next week. Pretty decent for tasseling and pollination. A little bit on the warm side, but again, we could do much worse given the calendar. I do want to take this forecast out a little bit further. I talked about some of this at the beginning with respect to the hurricane conversation. I am showing you the ECMWF AIFS. This is the 500 millibar height forecast, so where the troughs and ridges going to set up later this month. And I'm just going to take this forecast forward all the way out to the 19th. Remember, that was the kind of split in the forecast when we got near the end of the 10 days. The AIFS, this is a new model, right, from the ECMWF. It's using an AI backend. This is their ensemble, and it has been pretty consistent with this kind of, remember I showed you this at the beginning. If you have a ridge here, let's start here, ridge here across the Northeast Pacific, ridge here across the New England area, you generally have no other choice but to develop some what I call weaker heights or troughing in between, precipitation chances, less chances for heat. Now the chances for heat would increase in New England. For portions of the Northwest, this looks like a pretty favorable forecast, I would think, for the monsoon in the Southwest as well. Favorable for precipitation here through the middle part of the country with some question marks for the Canadian prairie. The ECMWF ensemble, so not the AFS over the same time period, tries to bring some ridging back into the middle part of the country at that kind of 10-day fork in the road. Let's call it the 20th, the 21st of July. It has this ridge almost moving too far west over into the Pacific, has this ridge here over the Canadian Maritimes almost getting off the continent. These are just getting far enough away. They're allowing some of the ridging to build back into the middle part of the country, and this would increase the heat chances. So we do have a difference in the model opinion out to between 10 and 15 days. That is not uncommon. We've also seen, we can see the same kind of thought experiment over here on the ECMWF ensemble. This was the drier forecast, and this is their Bermuda high forecast for July 23rd, near the end of the month. They're pushing it over here. We sometimes call this the Killarney high. This is almost east of the Azores, so a weakened Bermuda high with bias toward the far eastern Atlantic. If I show you the AIFS ensemble, a more seasonal, typical average Bermuda high. Not seeing a strong weakness or strength in either direction, and we tend to get low pressure system development here across the plains, increased precipitation. This is for that same date, July 23rd. Is one of these more correct than the other right now? I would lean toward the AFS just by persistence, right? We haven't seen the kind of weeklies, the ECMWF extended scenario play out with this Bermuda high yet. When it has weakened, it's been very brief, and it's resurged in a quick way, bringing moisture back, whether it's to portions of Texas, the Carolinas, or portions of the Midwest. So I'm leaning a bit toward the AFS right now just by persistence, but this is a scenario we will have to keep an eye on. And again, if that hurricane activity picks up in early August, likely indicative of that MJO moving over the Atlantic, and if it moves over the Atlantic, it's liable to get over toward the Indian Ocean at some point, phases 1, 2, and 3. As we transition into the month of August, we just saw in those analogs that tends to correlate with ridging over the Midwest. So there is a scenario here, at least turning the calendar month at the end of July, where we might have to return to a conversation about heat and dry weather. But right now, kind of looking outside the crop out my window, seeing the precipitation forecast over the next 10 days, the reason with full yield potential here, and we're not the only ones seeing this at this point. It looks like it's a pretty decent crop growing out there, at least over the next 10 days. I think that's going to continue for much of the month of July. We'll have to look at where we go in early August. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all on Friday.